Good, okay. Thank you very much, and I hope you've all eaten well, and I hope that Denver has woken you up after a fantastic lunch. I'm very glad that climate adaptation is being addressed on this first day, because it's an area of climate change and climate change solutions that is often left behind compared to emissions reductions. So I'm very glad that it's up front on this first day. And particularly as we've heard in some of the opening addresses by my colleague Liesel, by Denver, and by the PM's Special Advisor, Mrs. Mbako, Africa and the Middle East region are facing potentially huge impacts from a changing climate. We're going to see impacts on coastal communities, for example, from a rising sea level. We see agriculture, which is such a key part of the region's economy, that will be threatened by increasingly severe and intense droughts and precipitation events. And various other sectors of the African and Middle Eastern economies will also be touched. There will be no sector that is left untouched by the impacts of climate change. UNEP produces every year now an adaptation gap report, and our last report in 2022 estimated that non-OECD countries globally will need up to $340 billion annually by 2030 to adapt to climate change. Now that's an upper bound. The lower bound is $160 billion. So you can see that not only is this going to be a very costly problem to adapt to, but also the estimates of our needs are not well understood. And yet at the same time, less than $50 billion per year, less than 10% of all climate finance is allocated to adaptation needs. That said, climate resilience is there, it's upfront in the international agreements, so in the Paris Agreement, and in particular, Article 2.1c for financial institutions, it says that financial flows need to be made consistent with a pathway towards low greenhouse gas emissions and climate resilient development. We've also seen that the recommendations of the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures have embedded physical climate-related risks into their framework. And there is an increasing focus within public finance and international climate finance on climate adaptation over the last 2 years in particular. So just before COP26 in the UK, we saw the creation of the Race to Resilience to partner the Race to Zero. And at that particular COP, we saw the creation of the Glasgow Sharm el-Sheikh work program, which will hopefully deliver on the global goal on adaptation at COP28 this year in Dubai. What are UNEP doing? Well, my colleague Alice will say a little bit about that later, but we are expanding our exploration of physical climate risks and assessment and disclosure through our climate risk program. We're engaging with banks on the adaptation working group, and we're also engaging with public finance through the Adaptation and Resilience Investor Collaborative, which brings together development finance institutions and multilateral development banks to scale financing for adaptation. So we need to understand that adaptation is a common shared problem that needs public leadership and finance, but also private leadership and finance. So I'm very pleased to have today 3 panelists from across the public and private sector, and my colleague Alice at UNEP, an international institution. First of all, I have Dipeeka Ramgolam, who is Sustainability Reporting Coordinator for Mauritius Commercial Bank. Good afternoon, Dipeeka. Dipeeka leads PRB implementation of the Principles for Responsible Banking. I should not use acronyms, of course. And she's also co-chair of the Principles for Responsible Banking's Climate Adaptation Working Group, and we're very pleased that she's co-chairing that work. Then we have Saphira Patel, who is Climate Change Manager at British International Investment. And Saphira has around 20 years of experience in development finance and environmental finance, and specializes particularly in the just transition, sustainable development, climate mitigation and adaptation, and impact and sustainability reporting. And finally, Alice Anders, who leads on the accountability framework for the Principles for Responsible Banking, and is also co-lead of the Climate Adaptation Working Group for the Principles for Responsible Banking. Alice previously worked also at IFAD and the biocyclical vegan standard. So if you need to know more about veganism, please ask Alice. So without further ado, let's start with a little bit of an overview. As I've said, climate change is a complex problem and that it requires action across sectors because, as I said, all sectors will be impacted, and that requires collaboration between multiple stakeholders. No one organization can build climate resilience alone. One single organization can invest in a low carbon technology, but adaptation is a far more complex problem. So perhaps let's have an overview from the various institutions represented here and the different perspectives that they can provide. So one by one, perhaps 2 to 3 minutes, can you provide an introduction about why climate adaptation is so important to you and your institution, and what challenges are specific to the Africa and Middle East region in your view? Perhaps firstly to you, Dipeeka.
Thank you, Paul. Yes, I think that climate adaptation is even more important than climate mitigation, because in the world today we're already living and seeing the tangible effects of climate change. In parallel, I think together with implementing climate adaptation actions, it's also important to implement climate mitigation. With mitigation, for example, all that we are implementing today, we will see the visible impacts in 20, 50, or even 100 years. But for climate adaptation, we are living with the consequences, especially for the vulnerable countries. And then one thing that we also need to focus on is to ensure a reliable and resilient supply chain. There's a need also to focus on climate adaptation because many countries are dependent on others for resources, for food, and in the absence or any disruption in the supply chain, this can create conflict, famine, etc. I would say on the challenge part, for example, for Mauritius as a small island, we do have a big data challenge on understanding and assessing our physical climate risk impact. So here we have to rely and depend a lot on service provider. So there is accuracy of data, downscaling to the size of Mauritius. That's a bit, we have to depend and look for reliable data and also at an affordable cost. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Dipeeka. Perhaps over to you, Saphira.
Hi, can you hear me now?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay, so from BII's perspective, BII is, as a DFI investing in the private sector, BII's mandate is to provide productive, sustainable, and inclusive finance in order to develop the areas in which it operates, which are Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean. So in order to facilitate a creative, sustainable, and inclusive environment or economy, one needs to fully consider all the elements that affect, can change, can cause shocks to that economy. So within the context of climate change, there is the mitigation element, and we have the just transition, which is dealing with that, but we also have the adaptation and resilience element. And what happens here is that in the event that we go ahead and we fund the just transition and we support the move towards net zero, but we forget about adaptation and resilience, the transition will not be just. It would be a great deal more expensive because we'd be faced with these climate shocks on an ongoing basis. And if we haven't built resilience within our economies, within our societies, to adapt to and to be able to weather those shocks, then it's kind of like, why are we doing what we're doing? So we absolutely need to focus on the adaptation and resilience elements as much as we focus on the mitigation and the inclusivity and the various other elements of development. So BII does this in two ways. We focus on climate finance with the aim of actively contributing to climate change action, and we also focus on to ensure that all of the investments that BRI makes facilitate an emissions reduction, but at the same time, improve the climate resilience, not only of the BRI portfolio, but also of the economies within which we work. Additionally, the way we do this is by ensuring that adaptation and resilience is one of the 3 building blocks of our climate change strategy. And that speaks to making sure that we recognize that the world has challenges. There are vulnerable communities that need to be supported in their resilience and adaptation actions. Additionally, we need to consider the physical risks that come with climate change that we can mitigate through effective adaptation and resilience building. And lastly, it's really critically important, as mentioned earlier, that we will not have a just transition if we don't provide sufficient attention and fully integrate adaptation and resilience solutions into all of our just transition plans, our JETPs, or any other plans we're putting in place to support our move towards low carbon and inclusive economies.
And finally, just this short question over to Alice.
Work? Yeah. So we've already heard about data challenges and then looking at resilience. I think from the UNEP FI perspective, when we're working on the global stage and looking at banks globally, one of the big difficulties when we're thinking about adaptation is really understanding, okay, so how do we take something that's so local and so region specific that changes depending on where the project is and takes very different shapes? How do we take that and turn that into a global framework? How do we find a way of making this tangible to financial institutions who have many other competing priorities and still create something that takes into account these very important aspects that cross into other impact areas? When we think about the principles for responsible banking framework, it's not just adaptation. Adaptation works into all of these other impact areas, and we've heard it when we talk about the climate change strategy, which is both mitigation and adaptation. We take social aspects into account, biodiversity plays into it. So from the UNEP FI perspective, I guess the opener is just how do we take all of those issues and boil them into something that is applicable and usable by banks globally.
Thanks very much. So really just to summarize the key challenges in adaptation, I'm sure this is not an exhaustive list, but Dipeeka, you mentioned data as being a real challenge, particularly for commercial banks, and your particular problem being located in an island state. We also heard from Saphira around the problem of developing financial instruments to tackle adaptation, and also how it can be embedded across all the kinds of investments that you make. And then Alice talked about how this problem of adaptation is very location specific, and then how do you develop a global framework to address this issue? So that certainly I could think of more challenges as well, but clearly it's something that is taking time to address and will need collaboration between different stakeholders. So perhaps then I can bring in how the public sector can support private investment. And this would be a question to you, Saphira. Businesses often perceive greater financial risks of investing in climate adaptation because the investment is now, but perhaps the benefits are many years in the future and will not accrue entirely to their institution solely. So how can public finance be used to help mitigate these risks? And why do we need the private sector to be engaged in climate adaptation financing?
Thanks for that question. So basically, it comes down to collaboration. Adaptation, resilience, investments, and finance isn't the domain only or the sole domain of public sector. There has been a perception that it's something that private sector can't play in because there's nothing really very tangible often that you can take away and that you can sell. There's also the perception that government needs to create the enabling environment to support private sector investment within adaptation and resilience. And then we can leave it there, but that's not how it works. we know that in order to get anything done, we do need to bring the two sectors together. With respect to the government or the public sector, the one gap that we've noticed almost in most economies in which we work is that there isn't an enabling environment. The government needs to support the creation of such an enabling environment in order to bring private sector funding in, and that usually speaks to the issues of risk and barriers to entry. So what we do is we try to work with the governments to create the institutional policy and the regulatory frameworks that de-risk moving into adaptation resilience investment. And then secondly, another area where public and private sector need to work quite closely, and speaking to the government again, is how do governments turn their climate strategies, the NDCs, the adaptation plans, into bankable projects that can then be brought to the private sector, or the private sector can then invest in, either as a pure private sector project, but also as public-private partnerships. So the building of that pipeline, the de-risking of the sector, and the creation of the enabling environment are critically important when we speak to projects or adaptation and resilience projects. Okay. Secondly, how we bring private and public sector together and how we de-risk projects primarily speaks to the fact that it's very difficult to fund an adaptation resilience project. When we talk climate mitigation, and mitigation projects, renewable energy generally, it's a lot easier to put together a business plan or to fund and get everything related to the funding around, say, a solar PV plant. Whereas when you try and say, oh, let's go fund a catchment because it will help with flood resilience, it will reduce the impact of pollution within the system. You generally get people looking at you like, why? Why are we looking at catchments and flood now? Like, what does this have to do with sustainable development? But so if you take that context and you think about how do we go about de-risking that and what role does the government play, the one that's the easiest example that I can use is if you think back many, many years, say about 30 years, when renewable energy was just coming onto the market and governments were trying to get private sector to pick up all those projects because the government can't pick up each and every project that comes in from the power sector. What happened? Well, it took a while, and eventually government created the enabling environment. They de-risked the projects. They supported by the creating of policies and tariffs and subsidies and various other structures, and then private sector came in. And an example is South Africa and the REAP program, where the government de-risked the renewable energy by providing pay and take contracts to private sector developers to produce the renewable energy. And it has been successful enough that no longer does the private sector the public sector or the DFIs have to come in and support the de-risking of those projects. It's happening naturally. In fact, when we have the REAP rounds in South Africa, the projects get taken up pretty quickly. It's quite a competitive market now. So that's an example of how you have to create the enabling environment, and you have to bring the collaborators, bring the two sectors together to enable this. Another example of, one more point on that. So it took South Africa, or it took quite a few places, quite a while to get this enabling environment for renewable energy going. The problem here is that we don't have time, and we need that fast, deep impact in the adaptation resilience finance space. We need it now. I mean, we're experiencing the impacts of climate shocks all the time. We have droughts in Africa. We know Africa is going to experience more of the climate impacts from a drought perspective going forward. We've got, in South Africa, we had farmer deaths from some of the high temperatures we had earlier this year. We've seen the floods in KZN, in Mozambique. The situation's getting quite dire. So we can't wait for an enabling environment to take place and then eventually bring public-private sector into it. It has to happen pretty soon. And one of the really nice ways that we can do it is BRI has been involved with the Adaptation and Resilience Investors Collaboration, known as ARIC. It's a collaboration of private and public sector to basically help to overcome the barriers to entry within the adaptation and resilience space, but also to create that enabling environment that is required for mobilization of private capital within the space. And maybe on a good point there, UNEP FI has now taken over the secretariat for ARIC since January, I think, this year. And that's just going to help deepen the impact and get, a lot more of the work going. So coming back to ARIC, so the purpose of ARIC is to break those barriers, to mitigate the risk, to create that enabling environment, that systemic change that is required to move the capital, private sector capital, into the space where people had previously assumed that it was a public sector space and we didn't need to play in that space. And one of the key elements there is building a common language. Until everybody is on the same page and understands what adaptation resilience investment is, it's very difficult to say, oh, let's work on this, let's all do this, because there are no metrics. What does an adaptation resilience project look like? I mean, they're very context specific. You're not going to have the same sort of a project all over the place. You cannot have a cookie cutter approach. So the common language, the metrics that help move the finance flows, the capital towards the projects that we need are critically important. Additionally, by creating a common language and the resilience metrics, what you end up doing is providing a signal to private sector to say that here's the space you can work in, and this is how you do it. It's no longer this gray space that's really fuzzy and full of risk. And then lastly, clarity on exactly what adaptation and resilience finance is and how we're going to measure it. Because again, I don't think we're going to be very effective if we only measure financial flows within the adaptation and resilience space. This is about impact, deepening of impact, making sure that where you put the money, there's actually an impact coming, as opposed to, oh, we're putting a lot of money towards A&R, but where's the impact of that? So the metrics are critically important. And then maybe just moving on to give a few examples of the sort of work that BII has been doing in this space. We have what we call the Climate Innovation Facility, which is co-funded by the British government. And the facility is basically aiming to de-risk pioneering climate solutions that covers both the mitigation and the adaptation side of things. And one such solution is what we call the Equator Africa Fund. And one of the key projects in there, which I really like because it's an adaptation resilience project, is sun culture, where they provided solar PV to facilitate water supply for agricultural areas, for smallholder farmers. And then the impact of that was quite significant because, as we all know, Kenya has been struck by quite bad drought, and farmers, we don't want the farmers to lose their livelihoods. We need to be able to ensure that they are resilient to these things and they don't have to rely on, a grid-linked energy source that may be affected, for example, if you've got hydropower and your catchments are drying up. Following on from that, we have a really nice example of the insurance space that needs to be developed within the adaptation and resilience and general climate space. And there's a project called Pula in Kenya as well. We do have other projects. I'm just using Kenya for the day because they have the best ones for this. And it's a pay-at-harvest parametric insurance product, which helped the farmers to basically weather the storms that come with and to respond to the shocks that come with our changing climate. And Pula works really nicely. Instead of buying insurance up front, which generally the farmers were unable to do, they needed to spend their money on seed and technology and machinery for their farms. However, and they didn't have the money to buy the insurance, and then you get a climate shock like a drought and your crop fails. Well, what are we going to do? They didn't have insurance because they didn't spend the money on it. But when we do pay at harvest, you can pay up front. And then in the event there is a problem, you do get the insurance. You do get what you paid for later on. So these are just some examples of how BII has been working within the space, but also how important collaboration is between the private and public sector, and how important building a common language within the space will help signal private sector to join and work together within the adaptation and resilience investment space.
Thanks very much, Saphira. That was a very, very complete response, and it was really good of you to highlight the role of insurance. I mean, we have a lot of insurance representatives here today, and unfortunately not on this panel, but insurance does, of course, play a major role in building resilience and as a response to mitigating the risks from climate change. We do have our colleagues from, well, Butch is here from the Principles for Sustainable Insurance, and one of the major projects that the PSI is covering is the V20 Sustainable Insurance Facility. So the V20 is a group of 58 states particularly vulnerable to climate change. And the Sustainable Insurance Facility is a platform to work with financial intermediaries in some of those V20 countries to provide adaptation and resilience credit lines to micro, small, and medium enterprises. That is at the same time supported by insurance, so either parametric insurance or insurance that helps those businesses to recover from climate-related shocks. So if they receive this financing to make their business more resilient, if there is a climate-related shock, they are able to bounce back rather than to just lose their business but still have to pay back the loan. I mean, I'm not an insurance expert, so probably Butch could explain it better than me. But that's just one example of where we are working in terms of risk mitigation and hedging solutions to address adaptation and resilience. And one aspect of that is that we work with financial intermediaries, particularly banks, and by extension, the clients of those banks that are MSMEs. So I want to bring in Dipeeka here and just ask you, because you have clients that are on the front line of climate change, both MSMEs and corporates, what do you see the role of banks in contributing to positive adaptation?
Thank you. 10 years ago, when I was working as an environmental engineer in a cogeneration power plant, I never imagined that one day I would discuss climate in the banking sector. So today I'm very excited to be part of that sector, and because I strongly believe that banks have a critical role to play in influencing clients and financing positive impact, be it climate or even beyond climate, as a general nature protection financing. So I would like to touch on 5 areas to show how banks can be key players. The first one is risk management. It can be both for the banks, managing the risk for the banks, as well as risk for the clients. Today, it has become more important for banks to understand, assess, and integrate the financial impacts related to climate in their decision-making processes, and to support resilient projects for the clients. Factors such as climate hazards like extreme temperature, floods, etc., which are quite obvious in Mauritius, is becoming more important to be integrated in the financial risk management. For instance, the adoption of TCFD by many countries has proved that there is an urgency to act. And hopefully, with the publication of the nature-related risk TNFD framework, there will be significant improvement in tackling this, the whole subject of climate and beyond climate together as part of TNFD. The next area is about providing sustainable finance, which means that creating business opportunities for clients. What we have seen that climate adaptation remains still a subject that we need more clarity, understanding how do we assess and measure physical risk, which will feed our the development of a climate strategy for financing climate-related projects. I'm also part of the climate adaptation working group with UNEP. Alice maybe will touch on that a bit later. So we peer banks are collaborating on simplifying the way we understand climate adaptation, and a guidance document will be published recently as part of the working group to help banks understand and see financing opportunities within that framework. I'll take an example for MCB in Mauritius. We recently launched a product, a sustainable loan for financing capital expenditure. And together with that, we have also developed a taxonomy on 10 different categories. And what we also done is that taking the 10 categories and again categorizing into two main categories, climate mitigation and climate adaptation. And from there on, trying to see how we can push and be proactive to help clients with financing adaptation and mitigation. One element that I would like to highlight on is Principle for Responsible Banking Framework, which has been indeed been very helpful for us in understanding where are about environmental and social impacts, and then focusing on the priority sectors and clients. We have also started to take a targeted approach using the National Adaptation Plan of Mauritius, and then waiting also to get the physical risk assessment, which is an work in progress at the moment, and using both the National Adaptation Plan and the physical risk assessment results that will feed our climate strategy to help clients. The focus also should be on vulnerable sectors, because Mauritius, as a small island, we're also very vulnerable to the impacts of climate. So there's a need to focus on targeting the most vulnerable sectors and clients, as well as focusing on the remaining portfolio. The third element is about stakeholder engagement, partnership and collaboration with the government, NGOs, and other institutions, because if we leverage collective efforts to address the impacts of climate change, we can move faster. And the fourth area is about sharing knowledge, doing capacity building, and be really in the front line of raising awareness on the subject with our clients, pushing for all the subtopics that falls under climate adaptation, using the outcome of the physical climate risk assessment and guiding our clients, and also see what we can do together. On this part, I would say that there's still a big challenge for us, even if we do rely on the physical risk assessment outcome. For new projects, for new development, for new clients, it will be quite easy to implement maybe adaptation measures. But what can we do for existing clients? They already have a building, they already have this infrastructure, so how do we help them transition and adapt? It's more about adaptation and resilience to extreme temperature, high level of humidity in a tropical island. So that's quite challenging, and we are still thinking how we can do that. And the fifth element, I would say, is on the sustainable investment side. As a bank, we need also to focus and prioritize ESG criteria for companies that have a sustainable, more sustainable profile, and focusing more on ESG issues. And finally, I would say that, and it's my punchline, that I always use this in my day-to-day. So first one is understand, assess, and then understand, assess, embark people, act, and then measure impact. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dipeeka. It's really great that you highlight the issue of client engagement. I think because the clients, the businesses that you work with are the ones that are going to face the real impacts of climate change, but are maybe not talking about climate adaptation every day and the kind of jargon that goes along with that. And we've been working with impact investors, for example, under the Adaptation Resilience Investor Collaborative that Saphira talked about how they are at the leading edge of the finance space to identify how to measure adaptation impact and how to get that kind of data from the clients, well, sorry, not the clients, but the sort of businesses and the communities and households that they provide financing for. Because there's no one easy metric. Perhaps in climate mitigation you have a set of metrics, but they all focus on greenhouse gas emissions. In adaptation it's very different. And it's very different according to the sector you work in. It can be also hazard specific. So creating language that clients can provide you with impact data on is extremely important. So I think that client engagement aspect is particularly key. But as you are co-chair of the adaptation working group for the PRB, I think we need to delve into that groundbreaking piece of work. It's the first group of banks that are getting together, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, to look at this problem of climate adaptation at the global scale. So I'm very happy to have my colleague Alice here today to talk about the work of the climate adaptation working group. How are you and colleagues at the Principles for Responsible Banking helping to support the members of the PRB to respond to this challenge?
Thanks, Paul. And I think, this is just building on what we've been hearing so far about the challenges. So we've got a group of global banks representing all regions, about 25 banks who've come together to really discuss these things. No one has an answer yet, but that's the beauty of bringing together a group of banks to discuss these and to really brainstorm maybe the collation of all the different challenges could come up with an answer. So the overall aim is to develop guidance. So we will be releasing guidance at the end of this year, hopefully. This will be something that then will go into a pilot stage. So it's not going to be something that's finished by any means. But a lot of the work that we're focusing on at the moment, and again, picking up on some of the things that you've highlighted, is this idea of, okay, what financial products can be developed? What might be available out there? How can we creatively think about solutions? But also more simply put, how do we even define adaptation? That was our very first question. We spent quite a lot of time discussing it because it's not that simple. And even now we've defined adaptation at a high level, but what are the specific things that flow into it? Which financial flow can you classify as adaptation and which can't you? And this is something that then depends on the local or regional specific challenges and on that context. So to bring it back to the working group, we're brainstorming all of this together and trying to come up with a core set of indicators that might help us approximate what needs to be measured at a higher level that can then be adapted to the region or the local context to then be applied by the bank. This is something that's still underway, so I can't make too many promises, but it's a very interesting piece of work, and hopefully we'll have something in place for the banks. We also speak a lot about collaboration in this forum, and that's indeed very important. So we are working together with academia. We have a few collaborations there. We're also then looking to work together with insurers as well as investors to get all the insights from the different parts of the financial industry who are all thinking about these issues in their own groups, and we're trying to bring all those insights together. The idea when we speak about physical risk assessment, and Dipeeka, you were highlighting that physical risk assessment is something that is still not fully developed, but where you're still trying to find ways of better assessing these risks. In this working group, we're thinking about physical risk assessment as the foundation. And then to turn it into an adaptation-specific framework, we're looking beyond physical risk assessment. So once you've done that physical risk assessment, how can you think about the impacts beyond just the risk? So the social impacts, the biodiversity impacts, the mitigation, and bring it all together into an adaptation product. I won't spend too much more time on this just because it's emerging thinking. But as I was saying, this is something that will wrap up into a piece of guidance by the end of the year, and then get a few banks to pilot it. And then, yeah, we're excited to see the next steps and see what solutions we can come up with.
Thanks very much, Alice, and I'm pleased to make my own small contribution to that work. And hopefully, beyond publication of the guidance, because we need collaboration across the finance sector, we've already mentioned the role of insurance in providing protection and risk mitigation. I guess there will be collaborations in 2024, or at least working out how finance sector can work together more broadly. Is that roughly correct? Yeah, okay. Good answer. Right. So perhaps one last question, because we were hoping to bring in the policy-making perspective, the government perspective. So unfortunately, that was not possible today. But perhaps just a quick question to Dipeeka from the banking point of view. How can policymakers and public financial institutions help you as a bank in contributing to adaptation solutions?
I think they have a very important role because the policymakers, if they make, for example, make the climate-related risk and adaptation, even mitigation, mandatory for the country, it will certainly push the companies to adopt and act faster. So policymakers have a great role to play in that. And also, there could be some capacity building initiatives that they can drive and lead at the level of country. And public finance institutions, for example, development finance institutions as well, have a key role to play to provide finance incentives, grants, etc., to the banks to promote climate adaptation. There is also one aspect on data, which is really a key aspect for physical risk assessment. In this case, I think if at national level and even by policymakers, they can collectively work on assessing physical risk collectively, do some data collection at national level, and then sharing with the different banks. This could also help to collectively address the impacts of climate.
Okay, thank you very much. I think, so we have around 10 minutes. I was just wondering now, perhaps we have time for 1 or 2 questions from the audience. So if anyone has a question, please raise their hand. And when you speak, please provide your name, institution. And if you want to direct your question, please do so. Sorry, I have to get the microphone. So yeah, are there any questions from the audience for our panelists? I know it's after lunch, but you don't have to be so slow. Yes, we have one question here.
Thanks a lot. It's Mia from Sentry. I'm interested in the type of return that you typically see on adaptation investments, not necessarily the level of return, but the nature of return. Because you basically, the typical project is reducing risk rather than generating investment return. I'm interested in some examples there, if there's anybody in the panel that can comment.
Perhaps Saphira, do you want to respond to that quickly?
Hi, okay. So I can't actually answer your question, but what I can do is find the information from our investment team to see what we can do there. But I would like to agree, because a lot of the ANR investments are quite new, and a lot of them are being funded with concessional finance. So we aren't seeing, I can definitely say we aren't seeing big returns yet, but then we also have to define a return. Are we looking at a financial return, or are we looking at it from an impact perspective? Because I think that's one of the elements within climate change and adaptation that we need to consider. Sorry, don't want to go on too much, but we need to rethink what we consider a return and a risk. So bringing the human element into it, I think, is quite important. But I'll get the information for you.
I think, I mean, just to respond very quickly to that, we've been working with, I mean, again, I don't have a quantitative answer for you, but we've been working with impact investors through ARIC as well, through the DFI group on adaptation resilience. And they're very much focused on adaptation enabling investments. So these are sort of technologies that will help various sectors, various businesses to adapt. And they have developed a business case for those kinds of products. They're quite few and far between, and sort of they tend to focus on sort of early stage investments as well. There was another project we were collaborating with for a while, and that was the Coalition for Climate Resilient Investment, which was led by a broad coalition from across the finance sector, also engaged civil engineers, for example, hydrologists, to look at how large-scale infrastructure projects, which require massive investment, have long-scale time horizons, and therefore are very, let's say, exposed to climate hazards over the long term. And the idea there was to create a business case for investing in an adapted project rather than an adaptation-enabling project. So that's, you know, adaptation is built as a small percentage of the total investment, but over the long term, it should reduce the costs, the operating expenditure, and therefore, if you look at the full lifetime of the project, it will create, hopefully, a positive return. I saw a couple more hands up, yes, in the middle here.
Hi, I was struggling to figure out how to frame the question, so I won't judge you if you don't have an answer. What is the most useful thing that regulators can be doing? Because this is a systems issue. This is an intersection between the public and private space, and things that policymakers and regulators have possibly have more control over than the individual financial institutions and project developers. But you're trying to quantify something that impacts the system, and you're creating a benefit for the system. But from a regulator perspective, a central bank or a Ministry of Finance, what is the most useful thing they could do? At the moment, they're focusing on taxonomies, which are there to fill the gap when people don't have enough imagination to figure out what the various activities should be. And I don't say that in a mean way. I think there's a lot that we need to figure out. So are taxonomies, because I heard taxonomy mentioned, and that sounds really useful. Is there something else that they should be doing?
So I appreciate we don't have too much time, but does anyone have a 1-minute response to that, roughly? Or I can quickly say something. I think the regulators and central banks, again, it's a new area for them as well, I believe. I mean, making mandatory climate risk assessment and disclosure is an important part of that. What I've seen, okay, from a European perspective, not Africa, but what is starting to happen, we've seen that in the Netherlands, the Sustainability Working Group of the Central Bank has created an adaptation group led by insurers, which is bringing together banks, investors, insurers, of course, but also businesses, civil society, and government agencies and ministries to discuss the problem of adaptation. Of course, the Netherlands has a long history of tackling weather-related or flooding shocks, but it's that element of climate and how do you balance that risk amongst the various stakeholders. And that dialogue is starting to happen at the European Union level. So we sang the AU anthem this morning. I don't know if there are AU representatives here, but perhaps that convening of a dialogue between various elements of the finance sector, corporates, and governments needs to happen, and to have an open dialogue. Perhaps, I don't know, led by insurers as they do in the Netherlands, that could be a way to go. I don't know. I think we're still feeling our way a little bit. I'm sorry, there's no more time for questions. I know there were a couple.
Sorry, Paul, just one very last question.
Oh, okay, okay. Sure.
In the interest of sustainability, but as far as the AU anthem is concerned, you will sing it for us tomorrow if you don't comply with the time requirement. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Sorry, I don't want to labor the point, but maybe you can explain to an elderly novice what adaptation and taxonomy mean? But I'm sure you can go into lengthy things, but just very briefly. Thanks very much.
Any volunteers? Okay.
Not all at once.
So taxonomy is a way of classifying activities that we want to finance. It's a categorization system for activities, for operations. For example, you can have a taxonomy on classifying, for example, renewable energy, sustainable use of resources. You can have energy efficiency. So it's a classification system. And adaptation is more about how do we change, improve an ecosystem to adapt, to survive the impacts of climate change.
Yeah, and that could be a natural or a business or a societal system to respond to increasing impacts from climate change. I hope that's
so.
roughly. There is an IPCC definition. I can't remember it off the top of my head, sorry. 10 seconds to go. I would like to say thank you so much to my panel, Alice Anders, Saphira Patel, Dipeeka Ramgolam, and thank you all, the audience, for listening and for also taking part. Thank you all.
Ladies and gentlemen, Paul Smith and his panel deserve a sustainable round of applause.